Hey everyone, and welcome back to another World of Warcraft video. For a time, Blizzard had a steady enough flow of new races being added to the game. Every second expansion, we'd pretty much get 2 of them, and then of course, MOP happened, and that gave everyone pandas. But now, years later, it's been a while. I mean, some people are getting really delirious about this. They want playable Murlocs. Yep, playable Murlocs. A Murloc with the Ashbringer. Why the hell not? But actually, that may have been closer to reality than you might actually think. But anyway, let's talk about new races and sub-races for the next expansion of World of Warcraft. Now, I know that we only just started, but this is the bit of the video where future me has to hop in and say that very recently we had some data mining after the recording of this video. Now, that data mining suggests 4 new sub-races being added, including Void Elves. We're going to dive into that really soon in this video, but for now, just, keep in mind that Blizzard seem to be planning on doing some sub-races for the game. That seems to be a little bit more something that's likely now that this data mining's came out. But yeah, there you go. Enjoy the video. The funny thing about this topic is that, well, there's only so many races and sub-races in the game. Assuming I don't forget anything major and Blizzard don't throw in a curveball, well, if they add something, it should be here. Unless they do something really bizarre and like let us be crab people or something. If I was a betting man, though, I would actually say that the next expansion is either going to be fully based on Ashara and N'Zoth in the South Seas, or will be based on an Alliance-Horde conflict spurred on, behind the scenes, by N'Zoth. Now, if that is if it's the former, which is more traditional, then I think they might give us some new races to play with. But if it's an expansion that is focused about us going to war, then I think it makes complete sense to delve into the factions that we already have, give us sub-races, and just give us more depth and detail. So, what about sub-races? To be honest, I kind of lie. I don't really mean sub-races because they just don't make sense for every race in the game. What I really mean, and what I'd rather, is that they focus on adding depth to the factions. So for some, that might mean there's sub-races, but for others, for an example, a Gilnean human, it could mean access to some Gilneas-themed armor and stuff like that, in-game, as well as having your character talk in a Gilnean accent. So very much a mixture of having both character customization options and then in-game stuff that combines together to build out the existing factions and make them a little bit more diverse and interesting. Then, of course, just giving everything more customization options across the board in terms of hair and all that. So let's knock out the data mine stuff before we get onto what I originally had planned. So, data mining suggests 4 new sub-races being added to the game, and of course at this point this is 100% unofficial, though it does point to Horde players getting access to Nightborn Elves and High Mountain Tauren. You might be a little bit surprised about the Nightborn, I actually was, and that's something that I kind of argue against later on in this video, but the thinking is that the Blood Elves and the Nightborn have their shared magic addiction problem, and that the Blood Elves did help them out a little bit more in the Insurrection campaign. Then, of course, for the High Mountain Tauren, well, yeah, that makes complete sense. Now, for the Alliance, it's Lightforged Draenei, so that's the new ones from patch 7.3, and then Void Elves. This was interesting. It kind of implies that Illyria starts leading a faction of Void Elves and making other people kind of be like her. I think this would be really cool in terms of character development and what could be done there, and it certainly would make for a pretty cool looking character model. The only thing, though, for me is that the Void stuff seems very class-focused. It would be very strange to play as a Void Elf that doesn't have Void powers. But anyway, that is currently what the data mining suggests. And the way that I really read that is, this is what's in now. Maybe it is broadly just suggesting sub-races for everyone, which makes the rest of this video, well, pretty damn pertinent, I suppose. More pertinent than I originally planned. Alright, let's kick it off with the Alliance and the Dwarves. They're pretty much the easy one. You've got the Wildhammer, Dark Iron, and Bronzebeard, and then ideally making them just a bit more visually distinct than they are currently, perhaps, and adding in some unique options for each. Dark Iron Rune tattoos, Wildhammer Shaman tattoos, stuff like that. Hell, does it not make sense for the Wildhammer to be topless, leather-wearing, half-barbarians or something like that, almost similar to the Demon Hunters? But anyway, I think these guys are the most established as having sub-races, so let's just move on. Gnomes. They could have some really cool options. I've seen some people talk about a leper gnome that's regained its mind. That's definitely one option, though I'd much rather have a mech-augmented gnome. Stuff like having a metal leg, metal hand, that kind of thing. I think this would be really cool for people who really want the ultimate engineering-themed character, and it makes sense given what gnomes do. Mecha gnomes do already exist, but they are a Titan construct, they're the pre-Curse of Flesh versions of gnomes. I think it would be odd for a Titan construct to be playable, but I suppose if you really wanted to, you could have Earthen Dwarves be added to the game as well. but I rate that as not being very likely. Now, when we move on to Night Elves, the strange thing about their society is it's very much aligned around the idea of the men being druids and the women being like warriors, priestesses, hunters, things like that. One way to take this and make this more interesting would be for player characters to be, say, if they are a warrior, technically a member of the Sentinels, and then give them some Sentinel-themed stuff. That's one way of taking it anyway. You could just, of course, add in more in the way of character customization options and just call it a day. As I alluded to earlier, you could give them the Nightborn, but technically the Blood Elves would probably have the Nightborn as well. It doesn't really make sense for them to only fight for one faction, given how both the Blood Elves and the Night Elves helped out in the insurrection. Now, half-elves, in my view, they're just dull. Why bother? They're not that visually different. Kind of boring. I think that making elven society, though, more tangible to player characters, I think that's the core fantasy to nail in on if I was trying to make the Night Elves a bit more interesting. Now, as for the humans, you could do so much to make them way more interesting than they currently are, reflecting all of the different human kingdoms, and indeed all the different ethnicities and cultures involved there, would add a layer of richness to Warcraft humans, making them properly their own thing, rather than some like obligatory thing that was put into the game because it's an RPG made by humans for humans, so, you know, you can select a human when you play it, even though it may not make complete sense. How would this be done? Well, everything. Jewelry, tattoos, hairstyles, and then, you know, stuff like having skin color be more than just a texture swap in the base model. So, for an example, if you were to take on the Arathor tribe, right? Well, you could have some humans that are a bit more based around those. Different hairstyles, tattoos, hell, even slightly different voices to choose from would be kind of cool. What I like here is that there's a lot of very small tweaks that could be done to build a lot more depth, and it's the sort of stuff that does not involve making masses of new models, which would be quite, you know, for the art team, that would be quite nice. Now, with the Worgen, well, I'm not 100% sure what we would get in terms of giving them more depth, but one thing for sure is getting a new model. I think that's the main goal. Adding that with a stack of new customization options would be pretty great, as well as doing things such as making helms work out pretty well with them. As for the Draenei, well, they could have so much done. In terms of general customization, there are a bunch of new hairstyles and horns that have been added to the game, and some new effects for the Army of the Light guys, so giving those to the Draenei would be great. Now, for sub-races, I can think of two things. First, the Broken. Updated Broken models do exist, and I believe they can make those work with normal player gear with minimal issues. Of course, having a Broken Shaman, that makes complete sense as a core class fantasy. Then, I'd love a way of getting the original Draenei concept to be added into the game. I just love how the art looks. It's slightly more, like, harsh than the current Draenei, though to be honest, I could see why Blizzard would choose not to go with it, because it is quite the departure. But still, the Broken, I think, would be a fantastic option. Then, the Orcs. There is so much you could do with the Orcs. First, give these guys some damn physiotherapy. They have major back problems, so come on, get them down on a table, give them a massage, give them a standing desk to stand up at, and finally allow players to be an Orc, you know, in their full glory, standing tall like Thrall. I mean, come on, it's time. Past that, having brown Orcs would be great. Of course, lore-wise, it makes sense for the Mag'har tribe to have, like, made their way in, though I wouldn't be 100% sure if they could have that be more than just skin color change, but still, I mean, that's a thing in lore. I think players should be able to have it. As for other things, tattoos, tusk jewelry, stuff like that, all makes a lot of sense. Of course, there's clans like, say, the Shattered Hand and all those guys. The Warlords of Draenor versions are probably a bit too stylized for player characters, but in general, allowing somebody to, say, think about, like, what's the backstory of their orc, what, like, clan was it originally from, and maybe have some unique options there, I think that would be a great way to take it. Next, the Trolls. Well, these guys can easily have different sub-races. There are many different troll tribes in the game, and they're usually visually distinct. So, we've got the Forest Trolls, the Jungle Trolls, Sand Trolls, Ice Trolls, I might be forgetting one or two. These could be framed as new troll tribes joining the Horde, although there are already some groups like the Raven Tusk tribe who are already allied to the Horde. So, perhaps changing, you know, some of their, like, muscle proportions and stuff like that to make them feel a bit different from the Darkspear Trolls would be a way to, like, give you just more, like, variety in the trolls you can actually choose in game. And then, of course, just the normal, give him a stack more customization options. Tauren are interesting because conceptually they're quite easy to do with the lore. There's already some offshoot groups like the Yangol and the Tonka who make a lot of sense, and the latter, the Tonka, are actually allied with the Horde. But they're old models, and it would be a tremendous amount of work to remake them to be playable. Of course, the High Mountain Tauren do exist, though they mainly are just different horn options. Honestly, just having more horn options though, and just more other customization options would be a pretty decent way to take the Tauren, and then maybe just give them some unique, like, Tauren transmogs and Tauren stuff that they can have, and maybe making it so that, say, helms work well in a Tauren as well. Let's move over to the Forsaken, because these guys could be really easily added to, but the problem is, going too wild and having, like, undead orcs might cause some game design issues in terms of, like, the racial silhouettes, so that's really a decision for Blizzard to make. But still, you need only look at, say, Sylvanas. The Dark Rangers are a pretty well-established group of undead, so adding them would be a pretty decent option, although I'd be slightly worried that they just look like undead blood elves, and it could be the case that you walking around as a preserved corpse rather than a rotting corpse, like you currently are, would be a bit of a departure from the core, like, theme that they want for the Forsaken. So, a bit tricky in that one, but then, of course, you know, just more customization options, you get the drift, would also be great. As for Goblins, well, first of all, these guys need a new model. Come on, about time to do that. I would, however, like to see some of the really fat Goblins, like the new Gallywix model, as well as some tech Goblins. A bit similar to the tech Gnomes, but, like, with Goblin engineering, so, you know, like a Furiosa arm or something like that. I think that would be such a damn cool thing that you could put in your character. So yeah, there you go. That's most of what I'm interested in here. Okay, so let's talk about the new races. What would they be, and who would actually be keen to join the fray in our fight against the Shara and N'Zoth? Well, many have said Nāga. The idea of a rebellious faction of Nāga is certainly quite interesting, and indeed, play race or not, it's probably something we would get in that hypothetical expansion anyway. They, of course, are sentient. After all, they're just cursed highborn elves. And they would, of course, run into some problems. First, how do you put a pair of trousers in one of these guys? Boots, you know, stuff like that. Getting the rigs to work the player items seems like it would be quite a challenge based on how they move. And then after that, you'd sort of be slithering around the place. Would Blizzard be okay with that? One way that I could see them doing this is having a kind of degenerate Nāga. Now, you know, not a Channer, I mean some sort of magically messed up group of Nāga who are like half regressing back into their elf forms, like maybe the curse is half undone. Kind of like a scaly semi-elf, but that seems a bit far-fetched to be honest. That said, it would give them a lot more to work with in terms of, you know, interoperability with other player models, and plus the idea of a persecuted group of them breaking free from Ashara's Nāga, it seems pretty cool. But that said, I still rate that as very unlikely, and as for the Nāga themselves, I'm not 100% sure if we'd actually see a core enemy race be a player thing in that expansion. But hey, do you feel like a dumb oaf? Would you like to play one online? Well, if ogres were added, then your wish would come true. This classic horde race was in Blizzard's plan many years ago, but it ended up being cut from the game. Many thought that this was just because they were so very thick and they could not get through doors and things like that, but in truth, some ogre models in-game do actually fit through doors. I suppose the problem is that their in-game portrayal would somewhat have to change to be a little bit more intelligent for this to work. But there is one potential thing. The Mok'Nathal, they could actually work. Now, these guys are a group of half-orc, half-ogres. And as you'll hear in a bit, you know, I don't really like the idea of half-breeds, but with these guys, I think they're different enough that they could be their own race, rather than, you know, just mixing a pointy-eared, almost human-looking character with an actual human. That's kind of dull. Now, we've all seen Rexxar in the game. He's a pretty cool guy. He hasn't seen much glory in World of Warcraft, unfortunately, but, of course, him, Thrall, and the other founders of the modern Horde, they all go way back together, so they could naturally be brought into the Horde. There's some really interesting history with these guys as well, and also, they just look really cool. The only problem is that I don't really see how they would get introduced. I mean, the pandas, the goblins, the Worgen, the Draenei, and the Blood Elves, they all had reasonably plausible introductions given the expansion theme. I'm just not 100% sure how the sea would lead to the Mok'Nathal making a journey over to where we are. But do you know what the seas could lead to? Feckin' Murlocs. Now, yeah, I put them here as a half-joke, but someone did notice recently that the BlizzCon Murloc merch plush description thing, it wasn't plush, it was like an outfit you can wear, it said, newly emerged Azerothian race. A bit like, you know, how they, one of the other items actually spoils the ending of the Antorus raid, but unlike that item, the Murloc description was not changed. Now, is this them, you know, knowing that changing the description would look like they're hiding something? Who the hell knows, but it's kind of fun to think about. Murlocs, technically, are a newly emerged race, though. They started to crop up in the seas and the rivers of Azeroth when Illidan summoned up the Nāga in Warcraft 3, the Frozen Throne. But still, probably not. Although I want to include this fun tidbit. Art director Chris Robinson did once say that we, as in, us, we would be quite surprised about how close playable Murlocs actually were at one point. Now, I know that the original idea for Warlords of Draenor was actually based around the mongrel horde of Azeroth. They scrapped that idea, but I have to wonder if it involved playable Murlocs. But anyway, that's enough about dumb oafs and fish boys. Let's play as some loo roll wrapped around a cloud of energy. Or so I would have thought until patch 7.3, because the new ethereals do actually look viable as player character models. Their dimensions are a little bit funny, but I could see player gear on a technical level working with them. Now, the backstory of these guys is really cool, and they're generally just full of mystery. They operate in terms of being various different groups led by Nexus princes, and then of course they're generally involved in both Void and Prophet-related things. So if the next expansion was to have Void themes, then these guys would be a natural fit both as an ally and an adversary, so I wouldn't be surprised if they were added as a neutral playable race similar to the Pandas, but only in a Void and Space themed expansion, which, you know what, that might not be the next expansion, so they could be a bit more of a future thing. Next, I do want to mention the Nightborn. I know these guys are a Legion thing, but I have to wonder if they could at some point be added as a neutral race. I mean, they're allied with both the Night and Blood Elves, as we saw in the story of 7.1, and they've got a really well-established backstory. So that's just a thought, rather than have them, say, be a sub-race of both, but we'll talk about sub-races later. And finally, I'd like to slip in a personal one, the Tuskar. I love these guys. I'd be so happy if they were added, but you know what? That is extremely unlikely, because, yeah, they're very much a self-contained Wrath thing for the most part. So that's most of what I'm interested in here in terms of sub-races and more just interesting factions. The core way that I wanted to take this is, like, sometimes you see sub-race ideas and it's just sort of grasping at straws and making more sub-races than you really need. Plus, focusing too much on just sub-races means, oh wow, the character creation screen is packed full of stuff, but when I actually log in, it's not different. Well, if, say, the Stormwind humans and the Gilnean humans and all these different, like, human groups and all the different, just, societies within each one of our factions, if they have just a few little things here and there, that could make those factions a lot more interesting. If you have an Alliance versus Horde theme to an expansion and some of the world quests involve that, well, doing a world quest to, say, defend the Darnassian forest or attack them could give you reputation with one of those groups, which could feed into a system like this, and overall just make the factions feel a lot more interesting and actually a part of the world and the game that you're playing. So, there you go, that's my thoughts on that. I'd be very keen to hear one thing, though. Would you be more interested in going for new races, or would you be more interested in making the current ones more interesting? I said interesting a lot, but I think that is a good question and two very different directions. So, thank you very much for watching this video, and I will see you next time.
Mm-hmm.